Welcome, everybody, to a new podcast from the Faculty of Political Administration and Communication Sciences at Babes-Bolyai University in Cluj. It's a scorching hot day in Cluj, but then so are the topics that we're discussing today, because we are proposing something along the lines of what really happens to our world, especially our so-called international world. My name is Bogdan Radu. I am a lecturer in political science. Next to me is my colleague Anca Sinea, who are both doing research in international relations. And today we are going to offer an interview with Professor Jeffrey Sommers, or Jeff, as we call him. Jeff is a professor of political economy at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He's been a long-standing friend and partner of our department. We have been doing work with him together for a number of years. I'd like to kindly ask him to introduce himself a little bit and tell us what his experience is with both the broader field of international relations and international political economy, but then also his personal experiences with countries of what we call them former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, since we are, after all, in Romania, and we try to focus more on this part of the world. Please, Jeff.
Great. Well, first, Bogdan, Anca, delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've been based at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and two departments where I hold joint appointments. I'm also a senior fellow at the Institute of World Affairs at the university. Just more in terms of my background, I have some 3 decades experience in the post-Soviet bloc. For over a decade, I held a visiting professorship at the Stockholm School of Economics, which has a campus in Riga. So I was chiefly based in Latvia. And I've had a really unique opportunity, I think, a very instructive one in terms of being able to observe the kind of early accelerated process of transition in the post-Soviet space when thinking about the Baltic states. But also having traveled widely throughout Russia when I used to cooperate on some rather close level with Dr. Boris Kagarlitsky, a longtime noted left activist in Russia who currently is in jail with the war in Ukraine. So that's my set of experiences. And of course, I've been coming here for a few years, as you've noted. One of the things I've been very interested in with Romania is the kind of tiger character of its economy in recent years, albeit with a slowdown last year and with a slowdown this year, and some of the political developments which have been, I think, quite interesting the past year, perhaps more interesting than you would like here in Romania, but nonetheless very engaging for an observer such as myself.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We have discussed a little bit before this interview how we are going to do it. This will obviously be more or less a free discussion, but Anca and myself will try to guide the discussion in particular areas. So maybe now Anca can start with one of our first questions.
Thank you, both of you, and thank you, Jeff, for facilitating this entry point into our discussion, because it's quite relevant to discuss with somebody that has experienced international change firsthand. And obviously your very personal story about your professor friend who is right now in jail tells us a little bit more about the, how intimately you have experienced the changes in the region. Now, I'm sure you can confirm my assumption here that changes like this do not happen very often in international relations, because these changes are complex, and we haven't experienced such dramatic change maybe ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, as we're experiencing right now. And it is difficult, as right now we're in the midst of change, very complex change. It is quite difficult for usual, let's say, more interested observers of international relations to apprehend, a rigorous red thread a continuum in this, entire process. So it is very beneficial for us to have a professor from the United States, but also a professor that has experienced the region in a very particular way to help us understand these changes. Now, my first question regards this continuum. Many observers point out that there has been a significant policy rift between Joe Biden and the Trump administration now. At the more conceptual level, how do you explain this link between what has been before, not long before, 6 months before, as a vision for the world, for international relations, and what is right now, the vision of the United States? How can we make sense of it? Particularly if we have important actors such as Russia and China playing an important role in the world. Can you please try to help us understand the continuum of U.S. policy, or maybe the problem and the absence of continuum with regards to international affairs?
Right. Anca, you're absolutely right. I mean, we're both in an environment of continuity and change. So the continuity that we've seen is a period of U.S. dominance since the end of World War II, which is finally coming to an end. And this is what the Trump administration recognizes. And it's looking to preserve what power the United States has left without seeing some kind of collapse, which the Department of Treasury in particular in the United States government sees as a real danger. Now, there's been continuity as well in terms of some recognition that U.S. power is diminishing. And so we see that on one level going all the way back to Bill Clinton, even though he was part of that unipolar moment in which the United States was absolutely dominant. But he had the foresight to look decades ahead and at least to recognize that this would not always last. But it was really after the 2008 financial shock that we begin to see a recognition that U.S. power is beginning to diminish, and it's becoming more difficult to maintain control over the global system. With Barack Obama, I think we saw some attempt at both lessening foreign engagements militarily, even though he wasn't always successful, but he stated this as a goal, that the United States should not get as entangled in foreign affairs in terms of military engagements as it had in the past. And he recognizes that China is ascendant. It's no longer going to be just this vast reserve army of labor that is going to keep consumer goods, their costs lower for the Americans, and that they have to be confronted. So this, you'll have to excuse the length of my response on this because it's a very big question that you're asking. This continues with a recognition that China has to be checked in some way. And so we see that with the attempt at putting in place the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a goal that the United States had of taking all of the East Asian and Southeast Asian countries that are in this kind of rim around China, entering trade agreements with them in ways that will keep China isolated. Doesn't really work out. Then, of course, we just chronologically going through the presidents, we see Donald Trump come into office, and he also recognizes that there are these problems with U.S. hegemony being maintained, but he doesn't really have a strong administration his first term. So they're really doing very little to address this issue. I mean, I don't think he expected that he would win that election. One thing that he did do, though, was to introduce tariffs, and we can talk maybe a bit more about that later. But he does have this sense, and he's had this sense since the 1990s when he was just a public figure that was frequently being interviewed, that the United States needed to stop being taken advantage of by other countries, and that tariffs were one way to do that. I think he also sees it as a way of either reducing or eliminating income taxes, but that's another matter. And there's a history behind that that's actually quite interesting, but I'm not going to engage that immediately. We see Joe Biden come into office. Biden has a set of similar yet different concerns. So with him, he recognizes that these challenges to the United States are mounting in terms of its hegemony. He begins to address this more with industrial policy, so a rather more direct approach to this issue of declining U.S. competitiveness, especially in terms of green technologies. Also understanding that China is going to continue to be a threat, and that one of the really big vulnerabilities that the United States has is with the manufacturing of microprocessor chips, the technology that is behind everything that is right here in this studio. So he begins to introduce measures to reshore that industry, while at the same time looking to check the power of our competitors. And of course, that will be made evident with Russia and the actions that they took in terms of their invasion of Ukraine. So the United States takes a very tough line with Russia, probably led by Jake Sullivan. And then, of course, we see Donald Trump return to office. Donald Trump, like Joe Biden, sees that this deindustrialization is a problem for the United States, not only because of its economic competitiveness, but you can't fight wars if you don't have industry. And the United States has lost so much of its supply chains. So my Apple computer right here in front of me is an example of that. Apple tried to bring the production some 6 or 7 years ago of some select Apple computers back to the United States. They couldn't do it. I mean, they just kept running into really stupid problems, like we can't get a screw that we need on short notice. Just, the supply chain is just not there. So they had to return back to China. But Trump recognizes that the issue is a serious one, and he is going to try and address it again with tariffs rather than industrial policy. But he's also going to do something even more serious, and that is he is going to try, along with the Department of Treasury, to engage in this, as you were saying, Anca, an epochal shift in terms of the organization of the global system, completely rewriting it, understanding that we can't just continue with the same old U.S. liberal-led, whether that's in politics or economics, order, and that it requires a big, big shift. Okay, I've answered your question at some length, and I have a lot more to say on the issue if I can return to it perhaps in a few moments, but continue, please.
I agree with you, Jeff, that the system seems to be changing. It's not for sure yet how permanent this change will be or where it will lead in the end. But in this context of change, especially connected to what you said about the United States perhaps not being any longer this, how to put it, protector or guarantor of a liberal international system, I want to ask a few things about international organizations. Now, international organizations have been a mainstay of post-Second World War international system. There are quite a lot of these international organizations, and yes, they serve this purpose of creating or prompting cooperation, at times not perhaps the most fruitful, but some type of cooperation. Now, given this context, I'd like to ask you a few things about how you see the future of international organizations, and perhaps focus a bit more on those two big international organizations that, for us here in Europe, are perhaps some of the most interesting. One of them is obviously NATO, and we know that the American administration has been making rather acid comments about every country's obligation to engage with NATO, especially financially, but then also about the European Union, which has been a long-term partner of the United States, but at the same time the European Union itself is changing. We are talking more and more about this sort of military dimension of the potential military dimension of the European Union. So to cut this a bit short, how do you see the evolution of NATO and the European Union in the maybe medium term?
Yeah, a very important and complex question. If we take a look at the European Union, and if we take a look at Europe generally, the United States, on one level, has seen Europe as being an essential ally and best to keep it a friend rather than not, so that we don't repeat the disasters of the first half of the 20th century. And of course, we had the old saying of the first head of NATO who said the purpose of NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the United States in. With regards to NATO, I think there's some desire to alter that calculus a little bit, but I think that has been largely the U.S. Concern since the establishment of NATO. But with the European Union, let me first just start with Europe. With the United States, the big challenge for Europe, let's say going back to the 1970s, was to make sure that there was no accommodation between Germany, France, and the Soviet Union. That was the big danger from the perspective of U.S. foreign policy, that you would somehow match the productive capacity of the Germans and the French with all of the natural resources of the Soviet Union, and that if you combined them, you'd have a big problem on your hands. So the United States, of course, got very upset when in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, West Europe began building pipelines for natural gas to come in from the Soviet Union, potentially realizing that fear. But with the formation of the European Union, the United States saw it more as a net plus for itself, because it came into being at a time when more, for lack of a better term, neoliberal economics was ascendant, which was very much in U.S. interests. So as you know better than I do, in the 1980s, you had this big debate, which is still somewhat ongoing in Europe, but very important regarding the future of Europe and its economy. How does it retain its social character, yet at the same time be competitive? And so you have figures like Jacques Delors, who in 1986 claims that he can square the circle and that you could have both. It doesn't have to be either or. Well, it turns out it's a bit more complex than that. On the one level, I think Europe has done it, but at the same time, not entirely. And I think on the whole, liberal economic policy has, to use a pun, trumped the social dimension whenever the two came into too much of conflict with each other. So by the time we get to Maastricht in the early 1990s, we see a European Union that states it's going to be very liberal in its orientation in terms of its economy, and that the United States likes this. The United States has advantages, even at that time, in tech, also in finance, and that allows for our big players to enter into that market and to gain some significant share of it. So from the perspective of the United States, it's a net positive. And every once in a while, you would see, some in Europe make some noise about the need to maybe establish their own defense force. And the United States would then just say, no, you don't do that. Even though right now the United States seems to want, to some extent, for the European Union to do that. So the United States, always wanted to keep militarily Europe weak until now. We have a very different figure with Donald Trump. I mean, he thinks that NATO should be redesigned as an organization, one that is more independent of the United States, less, in his thinking, taking advantage of the United States. From Donald Trump's worldview, everyone's trying to take advantage of the United States. So NATO needs to be an organization that builds more of its own capacities militarily, weapons, and in terms of soldiers. And so we see the possibility of, at some point, a increasingly militarized Europe that might not always find itself in agreement with the United States and vice versa. So there's some potential for conflict there. So we'll see what happens. Let's just say the relationship is not as predictable and as certain as it's been in the past.
Yes, and I do agree with this. But what comes to my mind at this moment is a recent article in the Foreign Affairs written by Assistant Secretary of Defense for International and International Security, Celeste Wallander, saying that this very new policy priority displayed by Donald Trump with regards to the European Union may have long-term political impact in terms of designing another, for longer term, another assertive Western power, which might not, and we already see that, see eye to eye with the United States in some, maybe an increasing number of policy points on the common policy agenda. And that makes for, a community of ideas that has evolved over the past 60, let's say 70 or 80 years is diminishing in power. And obviously, in terms of ideas, the United States is a competitor. How do you evaluate such a possibility?
Yeah, I think it's certainly possible. Absolutely. And this is the danger that the United States over the past half century always saw, was that if you began to de-link to some extent from Europe, that it would become more independent and it would develop policies that were not always in line with those of the United States. So it's tricky. I mean, right now, of course, they are still mostly aligned, but the possibility for rifts to emerge is certainly there. And of course, we also, without wanting to get sidetracked too much, I mean, we have to look at the possibility of an entirely new set of, or a parallel set of international institutions being constructed by China. And with the possibility of, the BRICS actually taking a larger role in the world. But yeah, the NATO relationship will be interesting. I mean, because Europe is not of one mind, as we know, as well. So that's the other issue. It's divided. And the division is somewhat akin to what our former George Bush era Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, called New and Old Europe. So the socialist bloc, the old socialist bloc, represents New Europe, according to what Rumsfeld used to say 20 years ago, and Western Europe was the old Europe. And so they have somewhat different views on, although coming more into alignment with each other on foreign policy, but still some differences. And some differences in economic policy as well. So we'll see how these divisions get played out within Europe and how that defines what will have to become common policies as well.
But ironically, over history, in this divided continent that you pointed out we have here in the region, there has been one unifying, let's say, factor, which is Russia. Right? And the unifying factor that Russia has played over history is even more powerful today. We see a very divided Europe, especially over the past elections. The past year has been a year full in election across the European Union, and we have had an extreme right that has asserted its voice and created difficulties in negotiations, forming government, even at the level of the European Union. We see right now conflicts and tension. Nevertheless, we all see Russia as a common, challenge. Let's not put it in terms of enemies, but a common challenge for us that brings us together. Now, let's zoom in on this actor, on Russia, and let's try to find a bit clarity in the potential of Russia to bring the United States maybe and the European Union together or not. We see Russia in the middle of tension right now in Ukraine. Right, the war in Ukraine, which is quite vividly developing even nowadays for 3 and almost a half years now. We see a Ukrainian country that has become throughout this war inclined towards the Western community through its adoption of military techniques, military tactics, socially and politically as well. But then on the other side, Russia not being very happy with this drift, a very clear drift of Ukraine. Then we see Russia quite assertive in the Middle East. And after the fall of the Assad regime, it turns towards Afghanistan and it recognizes the Afghan Taliban government. And then we see the conflict in Gaza and Iran. So Russia is projecting itself as quite assertive
Yes.
and problematic as well. It's not making our life any easier in terms of clarity.
Right.
How do you see Russia in terms of, this new world, let's say, the new chess board of the world?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a return to a spheres of influence model that is in formation. Doesn't mean that we'll end up there, but the historical forces in motion right now are in that direction. And so the problem always occurs on the borders and defining exactly where a sphere begins or ends. And so that's where the tensions have been and are getting worse and will continue to be there, I think. If we take a look at the European Union, the issue of Russia is an interesting one, reflecting on that old Europe versus new Europe divide. I mean, as you say, I think rightly, there's more unity now. But just 20 years ago, there wasn't. So if we take a look at, say, the Baltic states, where, let's just be open, they do view Russia as the enemy. They'll be the first to tell you that. Jacques Chirac told the Estonians 20 years ago when they piped up about something regarding Russia, he just told them to shut up and to, mind your place. He was very rude. And now you have, Kaja Kallas, who's actually the visible face of the European Union on foreign policy. So the transformation has been just absolutely astounding in terms of this inclusion of new Europe and it even taking a leading role in terms of policy construction and implementation. So that itself is very interesting. And I know it has alarmed the Russians and they weren't expecting it to go this far. The question of Russia, I'm going to look at it from Russia's perspective a little bit.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's an old one, and that is, there's a lot of things going on in Russia, right? Just as there is in any country. So there are very big divisions there. Although, as our former ambassador to Russia, Bill Burns, under George Bush's administration and the head of the Central Intelligence Agency under Biden, as he said back in 2008, the one thing that seems to unite all of the Russians that I've met regarding where they are on the spectrum, the term that he used, anywhere from right-wing knuckle draggers, as he called them, to the most enlightened liberals, is the issue of NATO. That's the one thing you can unify everyone on. They don't want to see NATO expansion. And I think there's two. And so, within Russia, you've got chauvinists, ultra-nationalists, people that would love to go storming across Central East Europe again if they had the opportunity. I don't think they do, and I don't think they have the capacity. But, sometimes nations do very strange things, illogical things. And given the fact that you're here, you have to be very worried about that. But the traditional doctrine, of course, within the Russian military is one of strategic depth. That's how they've survived over the past 2.5 centuries, whether it was the Napoleonic invasions or whether it was the Germans in World War II. And that is that you just have to have a lot of land between you and your enemies. If you do that, you can survive an initial hit and develop the tools, the weapons needed to survive the initial attack and then come back. So for the Russians, strategic depth means to the West, making sure that the United States chiefly does not get too close to its western border, because there's no significant geographic impediments to a future invasion from their perspective. And then the Caucasus. So you can't let the Caucasus fall into enemy hands, because that geographic boundary is a protective boundary for Russia. So they, I think within the military and even within the Kremlin, they think in those terms. But again, you have these really ultra-chauvinist nationalist figures who are all about recreating Russian empire. I think to some extent, Putin has checked those voices up until at least very recently. So, for instance, when the Kremlin decided that they had to go in for whatever reasons, I know the reasons from their perspective, but when they decided they had to go into Crimea in 2014, and then the Donbass, they had figures like Alexander Dugin, who was running around, the Donbass with shoulder-fired missiles on his shoulder and saying, we've got to take all of Ukraine. And the Kremlin response to that was to fire him from his job at Moscow State University. And then you had figures like Igor Girkin, who the FSB sent to the Donbass to try and fuel or support the, if you choose to use this term, civil war in the Donbass. And very strange figure. He's a czarist. And he is a self-promoter. And he credits himself with keeping that civil war going and getting the Kremlin to support it more. But he crossed a big line in 2023 when he got very frustrated that the Kremlin would not make an effort at annexing all of Ukraine. He started saying some very unpleasant things about Putin, that he was weak, he wasn't acting in the national interest, et cetera, et cetera. Putin seems to tolerate criticisms from the right for much longer periods of time than from the left. But he was put in jail. There's a certain point where you can't continue to say those kinds of things. So I think from the Kremlin's perspective, their chief concern still is U.S. expansion. But now they see, I think within the Kremlin, I think their view has migrated. It's migrated away from just simply strategic depth to a position of we're never going to be at peace with the United States. And so we're going to have to take more of Ukraine than we originally envisioned. And that's what is so dangerous right now. I really don't see them backing off. I think they're convinced of the view that the relations are inherently hostile. And so it's going to be very difficult to end this in any way which isn't messy.
So in some way, we see the Cold War sort of, unfolding under our eyes, even with the situation in the Middle East, where, Russia and the United States, at that time, Britain and France, sort of retracting from international relevance in a way, but with Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq at the time. So we re-see the whole situation unfolding, and it's complicated. And of course, the way you exposed to us what's going on within Russia, with all the differences and conflicts and differences of ideas and extremes in some way, the American administration is re-engaging diplomatically with Russia. Do you think Trump has been sort of full of surprises in that regard?
Right.
But we have had, before presidents of the United States that have re-engaged with Russia, sort of putting an end to the chills of the Cold War, right? And it has been beneficial, and we celebrated these positions or these turns in in American foreign policy. Do you think, given the complication of the situation in Russia, right, within the internal politics, the internal kitchen, do you think this is an opportunity to re-engage? Do you think maybe a little bit of nuance of diplomacy backed by force could, be even more? How do you see the new Trump foreign policy trend being for international relations
Right.
with Russia?
Yeah, it's an important question, of course. So you were referencing détente of 1972, of course, where the United States did make this somewhat successful attempt at turning down the heat on relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. Thankfully, because of all the nuclear weapons we possessed, it could have gotten very unpleasant. And the situation was somewhat simpler at that time because of the figures in charge. So what Nixon sought to do and succeeded is he splits China off of the Soviet Union. And it's brilliant, and it works really, really well with implications all the way to the present, of course, especially with China not becoming, I would argue, the world's economic hegemon. But that's another discussion. So Nixon goes to China, splits them off the Soviets. Brezhnev is a real simple guy. He's not Vladimir Putin. I mean, Putin is, for all of the things that we can say about him, we can't say stupid. He is a strategic thinker. He's very cautious. You're not going to manipulate him very easily in the same way that you could with Brezhnev. I mean, what Nixon did with Brezhnev was quite simple. He brought him to the White House, and he says, all right, what does this guy like? He likes big cars and Hollywood actresses. And so he brings them to a big meeting there. He has a bunch of Hollywood actresses running around, and he gives them a big Lincoln Continental. He's happy. Things should be that simple. No. With Vladimir Putin, you could never do something like that. But nonetheless, the Trump administration is trying to reprise exactly that, as you were hinting at, Anca. And that is, okay, let's see if we can split Russia off of China. So the power dynamic is reversed. China is now the powerful actor. But if we can split Russia off of it, great. And what benefits would that give? I mean, number one, it would give China some headaches. They would have to be watching their border with Russia. But the benefits for the United States, of course, would be immense in terms of delivering cheap commodities again to the global system. That's one of the big things that the Trump administration sees as problematic and as a way to fix the global economy. Just as we did in the 1980s and 1990s, get cheap raw materials flooding back into global markets, which will bring cost down for everything. And that was one of the reasons why we saw this kind of neo-Belle Epoque at that period. And so the United States wants Russia to be part of its system of partners so that it can unleash all of those commodities back onto the world system at low prices again. But it's not working out very well. Trump is not able to do anything with Putin. China and Russia have both signaled they're not going to split from each other. They see the United States as treacherous, duplicitous, unreliable. Agreements are not kept. And so they're finding that the environment is much more complicated. Trump would like to still do this, but I think he's beginning to recognize that it's probably not going to work out. And so we may see that he actually turns to China and tries, just as Nixon did with Russia or the Soviet Union, to have kind of a détente to see if he can somehow repair relations, at least in the short term, to take some of that heat down because it's gone up quite high. But China is just so important in all this. Just one quick comment about this. So we saw this on July 3rd with Kaja Kallas as she engaged China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, really, really sharp guy. And she challenged him very directly on the score of China's support for Russia in this war in Ukraine. And he flat out said, we're not going to drop Russia. And we're not going to drop even our support for Russia in this war, because we know that if we do that, you, and I guess he's referencing to the West generally, you turn on us. We're next. So China is this wild card now that you can't avoid them. They're too big to avoid. And the old calculations of a West versus East, thinking of the East as Russia, not of course China, it just can't be done in isolation anymore. China's just too powerful.
So are we back in a situation pre-First World War where we have a clear multipolarity, just much worse?
Yeah, no, that's a good way of thinking about it. It's a spheres of influence model, a multipolar model, and the actors are far more important, of course, and more powerful. So, in a sense, yes. I mean, there are some differences, of course. I mean, there's. I'm not going to get into the Congress of Berlin and the dividing up of the world and all of that, but. There is an embrace of this idea, I think, by at least the United States and Russia, that we should be going in this direction. I don't think China wants it. I think China's view is that actually we should have a somewhat open order. They take a kind of a long view, a kind of Ming era view of trade as being a net positive for everyone. And China's business or commercial activities. I mean, its businesses can be just as terrible and shady as anyone's. I mean, but the view of the government is that China's investments in businesses are ones which will accept far lower rates of return on investment in exchange for stability. It's a really enlightened view, actually. It creates both more economic growth, more investment, more stability, and I think that's what they want. Now, of course, if you're in Taiwan, you're going to have other concerns, obviously, but I think and in Southeast Asia a little bit as well.
But this is right there a point of divergence between China and Russia, which can be an asset for the West to get into in order to stabilize the new world order in an advantageous, let's say, way for the West. I would say
it's a possible opening for that. I wouldn't say it's one that can't just be driven through very quickly and easily, but there is a possibility of using this as a wedge issue if done carefully. Yes.
Both of you have mentioned a lot of change coming our way, or change that's already here. Multipolarity versus bipolarity. I'm not here to say that bipolarity was necessarily the best arrangement, but we got so used to it that it became somewhat more predictable. However, if we look at all this, let's say, changes that create a lot of anxiety, especially in our region because of some not so distant past experiences. But in addition to this sort of, perhaps we can call it geopolitical anxiety, there is also a lot of anxiety coming from what is perceived as being the American administration sometimes vacillating position on a variety of hot topics. I can give the example of how initially those tariffs were presented, and then they were announced, and then some of them were cancelled, and then they were transformed. But then, even if you look at some of the official statements, you see sometimes the American president going against Ukraine, but then perhaps retracting some of it. So it's very unclear, it's very unpredictable what's going on from the side of the United States, at least at the level of declaration. So my question is, especially for these countries, the post-communist countries, how do you negotiate with this sort of unpredictability? What can you do in terms of foreign policy? Especially when there is this situation where you're led to believe that you have to choose either the US or the European Union, which I myself do not believe that is necessarily a choice. But sometimes it feels like you would have to side with one or the other. So how can this unpredictability, how can its effects be mitigated in, let's say, Central and Eastern European foreign policy ministries?
Well, obviously, carefully. I guess to use a popular culture reference, I mean, both the kryptonite and the superpower of Donald Trump is his just utter lack of principle. And so, you can use that to your advantage, but of course, it also makes things difficult. He personally, but there are very few things that he's personally invested in. I mean, a little bit on the tariff issue, a few other things that he's been talking about for decades. But he'll give up on anything, he'll turn on a dime when he recognizes that something is no longer in his advantage. I mean, he'll give it up, which can be a good thing, actually, in some senses. But yeah, it's very difficult to deal with a figure that is this mercurial and capricious. I think the thing to recognize about Trump is that, and let me backtrack a little bit. Let's talk about, just to make this concrete. So you mentioned the tariff issue in terms of them being introduced on what he called Liberation Day, April 2nd, where they had these really crazy levels of tariffs that they just started throwing out. And it had a very negative impact on U.S. markets for about 3 weeks. And then he started getting calls from Wall Street. And this was a good thing. I usually don't associate many good things with Wall Street, but this was a good thing. Jamie Dimon and some others called him up on the phone and said, just very simply, you have to stop this right now. And he stopped right away. He didn't come up with any elaborate reasons for why he had to stop. He just stopped. He just understood right away, okay, this isn't working very well. So if he's getting signals from people that he respects, and there's not many, but if he gets those signals from them, he responds. And so that's one way of trying to get him to respond. You'll never do it using, norms, values, all this stuff. I mean, it has to be a real pressure point, usually having something to do with money. So he doesn't want to be seen as the person who threw the economy into a recession, because he views himself as a dealer and a manager of the highest level of skill. Returning now to this tariff issue, I don't want to get into the weeds here too much, but they're guys that have planned this new policy for the United States are Stephen Moran. He's the head of the Council of Economic Advisors to the Trump administration, and Scott Bessent, the head of the Treasury. But Moran wrote a paper, which anyone who's interested in this stuff, I would really encourage them to read if they've got the time to read 20 pages of really wonky policy stuff. It was published in early November of last year, in which he describes why you want to impose tariffs, how you do it, and the benefits that you get from it. He's a real serious guy, by the way. And one of the things he referenced was the environment in which you could introduce tariffs, that it has to be done in a climate of incredibly stable macroeconomic conditions, such as we had in 2018 when it was done by Trump then. Really low inflation, really low wage pressures, strong levels of investment. I mean, the U.S. economic engine in 2018, everything was purring. It was about as smooth as it could get. Moran argues, in those conditions, you can maybe introduce low tariffs with some significant benefits, such as we actually got from that period. You'll note that Biden did not overturn those tariffs. And so, but that is very delicate. It's something that has to be done with the greatest exercising of caution. Instead, you hand this policy to Donald Trump, and you've got a chimpanzee with hand grenades. I mean, it's utterly against the climate and environment that people like Besant and Moran say you got to do this stuff. So they just must be at their wits' end with this guy. But he has responded to Wall Street on this question. So I would say that for European policymakers to just try and figure out whatever the leverage point is, but also to understand that you'll never be able to rely on him. No deal is with him solid.
Mm.
So it's difficult. Yeah.
What comes after Trump?
Yeah.
Right? We're not able to rely on maybe his policy style, very personalized way to run the United States, which is still and remains for very many reasons a point of, let's say, always guidance for so many reasons. Obviously, we see that Donald Trump is being supported by the population, embraces happily many of the policies and decisions. What comes after Trump?
Yeah, a lot of good questions, which have kept me interested. So thank you to you both. And this is, I think, the most interesting one, because we see with a world that is increasingly, not to leave you guys out, but is led by, in terms of decisions, by China, I think Russia, and the United States. All three are led by figures that with their departure, who knows what's going to happen? Xi Jinping is up there in years. Vladimir Putin is no young guy. Donald Trump is 79. I have no idea who comes after them. And could it be worse? Yes. Could it be better? Yes, of course, as well. But yeah, we have no sense of which direction we're going in. I think the direction of China is potentially the most important in terms of whether they, but it's also the one that has perhaps the least likelihood of significant change. So there is a new-ish, it's about a decade old, doctrine for explaining the leadership of communist China over the past 70 years. It's called the Triple Revolution. And so in the Triple Revolution, China's communist history is divided into three periods of revolutionary seizure of power, one, two, revolutionary, as it's called, reform, so Deng Xiaoping's reforms, which put in place the productive capacity, actually, for a future socialist system, and all of the compromises and accommodations that were made with the market. I think this is like really self-serving in terms of their description, because I think Deng Xiaoping actually really was looking to make serious market reforms that would have been long-lasting. But anyway, and then what's called the New Era, that's under Xi Jinping. And that this is finally the period in which they are actually pursuing socialism. And to see whether that's going to hold up as a guiding principle, the need to, as they see it, actually, now that they put in place all the productive capacity to actually create a socialist system, if that's the direction they're going to go in. Now, of course, it's the left in China that promotes this view. But Xi Jinping himself does as well. So we'll see what happens there. But with Donald Trump, I don't know. The United States is so chaotic right now politically, and so tense. That's the only word I could use for it. It's really tense. So people have a lot of stress, anxiety, and they're really willing to go at each other's throats.
I think that makes two of us,
yes,
right? Let's force a positive end to this discussion.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to force
Are you
an ambiguous
Okay, go ahead.
end. This is something that occurred to me. Anca and I had a discussion this morning, and this idea came to me. And it's not directly, it's not at the core of our discussion, but I think it may be relevant. We were taught when we learned international relations that for some reason, which I always found shaky, international relations is something that's rather separate from other political issues. Like, it has its own theories, it has its own dynamics. However, lately it feels that, which in a way it's more natural, that domestic policy or internal politics are very much embedded into international relations and the other way around. And we see it more and more. We see it in the way, let's say, some of the illiberal or far-right populist parties in Central and Eastern Europe have been referenced by some American officials, for example, or they got some sort of support. So I'm wondering how you see this evolution of the international affecting the national, and then the national influencing the international. Perhaps where are the entry points of this sort of melange, or whatever it could be called?
Yeah, I guess I would just first state that it just really strikes me with your remarks that we saw how domestic considerations were so important in Bill Clinton's administration in terms of foreign policy. Really one of the big driving factors for the big directional shift we saw under his presidency, especially in terms of turning toward what Donald Rumsfeld would later call New Europe. Chiefly based on just the desire to get the Polish vote, which was needed for the '96 election and also for the '94 midterms. I really wish I had more insight and wisdom into this. I mean, on one level, we see this kind of alliance of villains that Donald Trump seems to want to lead and to promote and cultivate these figures and form them into some block of rather strange figures, who of course would have policy interests that would be aligned with each other. Otherwise, they wouldn't share this desire to be paired. I find us in an unsettling period in which I guess interests and norms and values are not lining up in any kind of clear way, and so it's hard to come up with a guiding set of principles for foreign relations, even if it was, if we want to be cynical and say that it was purely instrumentalist and opportunistic in terms of pairing liberal values with U.S. foreign policy. I think there was some of that, but I think there was also some genuine held principles as well.
So many changes, changes in the international sphere, changes in terms of leadership styles, and filtering of democratic force of the population.
Right.
And I think that is part of the leadership. And there's a lot of licensing going on in internal policies and foreign affairs that are we can see. But what strikes me right now is that the try of many experts, foreign affairs experts all over the place, and foreign affairs publications and podcasts and all over, trying to find opportunity, right? So I would close this podcast maybe with, of course, a positive twist to it. And let's look forward to opportunities in this chaotic times that we're looking forward. Obviously, I'm very thankful for our discussion today and for being able to try to explain some of the complicated aspects of the world around us. And we would like to invite all of our listeners to join this conversation and engage more and more into this type of exchanges to create clarity in the world that we live in.
Yeah. Well, any discussion that forces me to think is a net win, so thank you. Anca.
Thank you, Jeff.
Bogdan,
Thank you,
so
Jeff.
much for an interesting hour.
And thank you all for watching.